Hello and happy Friday. It's time for a read aloud. We haven't had a read aloud for a few weeks because we've had shortened weeks due to our winter break that got extended a little bit by our snow. So it's nice to be back to normal week, a full week of being in school. It's nice to see that snow melting. And that I found a book that kind of reminded me of spring. It's called The Little House, and just seeing the flowers on front and the sun just made me think spring and happier weather. And this is also one of my favorite books that I can remember my librarian reading to me when I was in school. It's by Virginia Lee Burton, and you could probably think of some other books, but it was actually written in 1942. So I'm not that old, but it was around when I was in school. So I can remember going to our library and hearing our librarian, Mrs. Forrest, reading it to us. So it just brings back good memories. So I thought it would be a good book to read today. So I'm going to actually go, we'll turn this way. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. And the man who built her so well said, "This little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren living in her." So they built it a long time out in the country. You don't see any other houses around them. The little house was very happy as she sat on the hill and watched the countryside around her. She watched the sun rise in the morning, and she watched the sun set in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different from the one before, but the little house stayed just the same. I'm going to show you the pictures. You see down here, they have a corral with it looks like horses and cows. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon, then back again to a thin old moon, and when there was no moon, she watched the stars. Way off in the distance, she could see the lights of the city. The little house was curious about the city and wondered what it would be like to live there. So one of the things you want to notice is how things start to change. So she lives way out in the country and far away, kind of like Whiting. If you go to the lakeshore, you can see across the lake, Michigan. You can see the city sometimes when it's a clear night and you can see the lakefront. Time passed quickly for the little house as she watched the countryside slowly change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun warmer, she waited for the first robin to return from the south. She watched the grass turn green, she watched the buds on the trees swell and the apple trees burst into blossom, and she watched the children playing in the brook. So that definitely looks like spring, doesn't it? And we're looking forward to hopefully just one more month of seeing some spring weather. In the long days of summer, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves, and the white daisies cover the hill. She watched the gardens grow, and she watched the apples turn red and ripen, and she watched the children swimming in the pool. Summer seems so far away right now, right? To think of warm, hot weather. In the fall, that's my favorite season. When the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she watched the first frost turn the leaves to bright yellow and orange and red. And she watched the harvest gathered and the apples picked. And she watched the children going back to school. That's what we do in the fall. Except they look a little bit different. They're riding on a horse and buggy. We don't ride on horse and buggies to school, right? In the winter, when the nights were long and the days short, and the countryside covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating. Year followed year. The apple trees grew old, and the new ones were planted. The children grew up, and they went away to the city. And now at night, the lights of the city seemed brighter and closer. Thanks. One day, the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road. Pretty soon there were more of them on the road and fewer carriages pulled by horses. Pretty soon along came some surveyors, and they surveyed a line in front of the little house. A surveyor decides where your house would start and where your neighbors would begin. So they figure out where your property is and your neighbor's is. Pretty soon along came a steam shovel and dug a road through the hill covered with daisies. Then some trucks came and dumped big stones on the road. Then some trucks with little stones. Then some trucks with tar and sand. And finally, a steamroller came and rolled it all smooth, and the road was done. So here, the little house is used to being by itself out in the country, and here come all these trucks and steamrollers. Now the little house watched the trucks and automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, and small houses followed the new road. Everyone and everything moved much faster now than before. So before they didn't have cars, now they have cars, and look at all those houses. So the little house is not by itself anymore. Remember, he said it felt like the city was getting closer and closer. More roads were made, and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenement houses, schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded around the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her anymore. She couldn't be sold for gold or silver, and so she just stayed and watched. So now she was in the countryside. Now all of these buildings have come up around her, but no one's living in her, so she's sad. Now it was not so quiet and peaceful at night. Now the lights of the city were bright and very close, and the street lights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and she didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Pretty soon there were trolley cars going back and forth in front of the little house. They went back and forth all day and part of the night. Everyone seemed to be very busy, and everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Pretty soon there was an elevated train going back and forth above the little house. The air was filled with dust and smoke, and the noise was so loud that it shook the little house. Now she couldn't tell when spring came, or summer, or fall, or winter. It all seemed about the same. So if you've been, this looks a little bit like Chicago. We have the L in Chicago. That's an elevated train, and a lot of smog usually, and dust from all the cars and trains and everything in the city. Pretty soon there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it and hear it. People were moving faster and faster, and no one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by without a glance. Can you even see the little house? With the trains above it and below it and all around it. Pretty soon they tore down the apartment houses and tenement houses around the little house, and they started digging big cellars, one on each side, and the steam shovels dug down 3 stories on one side and 4 stories on the other side. Pretty soon they started building up. They built up 25 stories on one side and 35 stories on the other. So now they're building high rises like you see in Chicago. Some that are even like 90, 100 floors, right? Now the little house only saw the sun at noon and didn't see the moon or stars at night at all because the lights of the city were too bright. She didn't like living in the city, and at night she used to dream of the country and the field of daisies and the apple trees dancing in the moonlight. The little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty. Her windows were broken and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked shabby, though she was just as good a house as ever underneath. See if you can even see her in there. She looks sad, all boarded up. Then one fine morning in spring, along came the great-great-granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. She saw the shabby little house, but she didn't hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. And she said to her husband, That little house looks just like the little house my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl. Only that little house was way out in the country on a hill covered with daisies and apple trees growing around. So she recognizes the house, but she's thinking it used to be out in the country. How could it be this little house? They found out it was the very same house, so they went to the movers to see if the little house could be moved. The movers looked the little house all over and said, "Sure, this little house is as good as ever. She's built so well we could move her anywhere." So they packed up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved her out of the city. So she finally gets to hopefully go back to the countryside and get out of the city that she wondered about. And look at, they found a new spot for her. At last, the little house. At first, the little house was frightened, but after she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled along the big road and they rolled along the little roads until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw the green grass and heard the birds singing, she didn't feel sad anymore. They went along and along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right place. They tried the little house here and they tried her there, and finally they saw a little hill in the middle of a field, the apple trees growing around. "There," said the great-great-granddaughter, "that's just the place." "Yes, it is," said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and slowly they moved the house from the road to the hill. Yep. Hold on. There we go. The windows and shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. And as the little house settled down on her new foundation, she smiled happily. Once again, she could watch the sun and the moon and the stars, and once again she could watch spring and summer and fall and winter come and go. And once again she was lived in and taken care of. And look at how happy she is. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her. A new moon was coming up. It was spring, and all was quiet and peaceful in the country. The end. So she started off living in the country and always wondering what it was like out in the city. And then she lived in the city and she decided that was not where she wanted to live. So think about, where would you like to live if you could live anywhere? Because there's great things about living out in the country, but if you live way, way out in the country, it's a long ride to school, it's a long ride to the grocery store, you're not as close to other people. But then if you live in some place like Chicago or the city, it's definitely a lot noisier and a lot smoggier with all the cars and trucks and trains. It's loud, but you have everything right there, right? You have lots of opportunities to do and see things. So think about, where would you rather live? Would you rather live out in the country where you're kind of farther away with lots of flowers and trees and land, or would you rather live in the city where you're close to more action and where things are happening? So, and then we're in Whiting. Think about, we're definitely not in the country, but we're not necessarily living the city life. We don't have subways or the L or all of those high rises. So we're more of a suburb, a little bit different. So, but think about the type of place sometime way down the road when you grow up where you think you might want to live. All right, everyone, have a great Friday.